At 6 a.m., my son texted me, "Plans changed. You're not coming on the cruise. My wife wants only her family." The cruise was a spiritual project I had been planning for 3 years. I paid a total of $45,000 for it. So the next day, I canceled the payments, sold the house, and left town. When he came back, the house. My wife's name was Beverly. 34 years married, and in every one of them, she found some way to give something away. She kept a coffee can on the kitchen counter, not for spare change, for other people's spare change. Neighbors would drop a few dollars in when they had it, and when the furnace 2 doors down went out one January, that can covered half the repair before anybody had to ask. She drove an elderly woman from church to her dialysis appointments every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years, and never once mentioned it unless I brought it up first. I used to tease her about it gently, the way you tease someone about a habit you secretly admire more than you let on. I'd say, "Beverly, we're not made of money," and she'd say, "No, but we're made of enough," and that was usually the end of the conversation, because there wasn't much you could say back to that kind of certainty. She had a way of being generous that never felt like generosity while it was happening. It felt more like she was simply correcting an oversight, putting something back the way it should have been all along. We met at a church picnic when I was 24 and working part-time at my father's store, still deciding whether I wanted the life that was clearly waiting for me there or something else I hadn't found yet. She was serving potato salad off a folding table, and she gave me a look that said she already knew I was going to ask her out before I'd worked up the nerve to do it. She was right, of course. She usually was, about people, in a way that took me years to fully appreciate and even longer to stop being unsettled by. When our son got married, Beverly sold her mother's ring, the one she'd always said she wanted buried with, to help cover the difference on the wedding hall, because he and his fiancée had come up short and were too proud to ask. She never told him. I only found out because I was the one who drove her to the pawn shop and sat in the truck while she went in. I remember asking her, afterward, whether she regretted it, giving up something she'd told me for years she wanted buried with her. She looked at me like the question genuinely confused her. "It's just a ring, Wes," she said. "He's my son." There wasn't a version of that sentence in her head where those two facts competed with each other. She got sick in the spring, 3 years back, pancreatic, 11 months, start to finish. I was there for all of it. The diagnosis in a small consultation room that smelled like hand sanitizer, the first round of treatment that made her lose her appetite for the food she'd cooked our whole marriage, the slow accumulation of machines and schedules, and the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone through something you can't fix no matter how much you want to. And I want to be clear about something before I go further. When I say I planned this cruise, I don't mean I planned a vacation. Beverly used to talk about the places she wanted to see. The fjords, mostly, and one small chapel outside a town in Norway her grandmother had described to her as a girl. Black spire, white walls, a view of the water her grandmother said made you feel like you were standing at the edge of something. Her grandmother had grown up not far from there before immigrating, and had told Beverly about that chapel so many times over the years that Beverly used to say she could see it with her eyes closed, could describe the exact color the sky turned in the evening, even though she'd never once stood there herself. She never got there. Somewhere around month 9, lying in that hospital bed, thinner than I'd ever seen her, she made me promise that when it was over, I'd take the family, all of us, together, to see it for her. Not to scatter her ashes there, just to go stand where she'd always wanted to stand. She said, "Take our son. Let him see what I've had in my head all these years." I promised her I would. My name doesn't matter much to this story, but I'll give it anyway. I'm 61. I run a hardware store, the same one my father ran before me, and I've spent most of my life avoiding conflict the way you avoid a hot stove. That's my flaw, and I knew it even then. I don't ask questions when someone I love tells me a number. Beverly could say the roof needs $4,000, and I'd write the check without asking which roofer, which quote, why. I carried that same habit straight into planning this trip. For 3 years, I sent money to a travel agent downtown, to a cruise line, to excursion companies in Norway. I never once made my son put anything in writing about who was actually going, because he was my son, and you don't put your son in writing. The last 2 installments had been arranged years back to draft automatically once the sailing began, just to spread the cost evenly across the calendar. Neither of us thought much about what that meant until it mattered. And the morning it happened, I remember the time exactly, because my phone doesn't usually buzz before 6:30, and the sound of it on the nightstand woke me out of a dream I don't remember anymore. The message was from my son. Plans changed. You're not joining the cruise. His wife wanted it to be just her family this time. Sorry, Dad. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen in my socks, the coffee maker not even started yet. I want to be honest with you about something. My first thought wasn't anger. I actually walked over to the window, like the morning light might make the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The neighborhood was doing the ordinary things a neighborhood does at that hour. A sprinkler ticking 2 doors down, someone's dog barking once and then thinking better of it. None of it matched what I was holding in my hand. I read the text a 3rd time, looking for a version of it that made more sense than the version I already understood perfectly well. There wasn't one. It said what it said. Plans changed. That was the whole of it, dressed up as a scheduling update instead of what it actually was, which was a decision that had clearly already been made and finalized somewhere I hadn't been consulted by people who'd apparently discussed it enough to be comfortable delivering the outcome to me at 6 in the morning like a weather report. I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I texted back, "This is was the trip for your mother. Call me. Nothing for 2 hours. I made the coffee I hadn't started yet. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my phone every few minutes the way you check a wound to see if it's actually as bad as it felt the first time you looked at it. When he finally called, I could hear him in a parking lot somewhere, wind hitting the phone. Dad, don't make this a thing, he said. His wife had been under a lot of pressure with her mother flying in, and she just wanted it to feel like a family trip. He stopped there. Not a what? Not a memorial. She says it feels heavy, he said. She wants it to be fun. I stood in that kitchen holding the phone, and I didn't raise my voice. Your mother wanted to see that chapel, I said. I promised her. Figure it out, Dad, he said. I've got to go. Then the line went dead. Not slammed, not shouted, just gone, like I was a call he'd finished with. That flat, ordinary click did something to me that yelling never could have. I hung up, and I didn't call him back. I sat there for a long time with the phone still in my hand, the coffee going cold, trying to identify the exact shape of what I was feeling, and not quite managing it yet. I want to tell you about someone else before I go further, because it matters to where this story ends up. Beverly had a hospice nurse in her last 2 months. A woman who used to come by even after her shift ended, just to sit with Beverly so I could shower or sleep for an hour, who never once made it feel like a favor, even though it plainly was one. She'd bring her own knitting some evenings and just sit in the chair by the window while Beverly slept, so that if Beverly woke up disoriented in the middle of the night, there'd be a familiar face there instead of an empty room. She still called me every few months after Beverly passed, not for anything, just to check in, the way some people simply keep showing up in your life long after the reason they entered it has ended. That same afternoon, she called like she always did. When I told her what my son had said, she went quiet on the line for a second, longer than her usual pause. Beverly used to tell me you were the most stubborn, generous man she ever met, she said. I always wondered which one would win out. Then she said, I'm sorry, and she meant it plainly, the way people mean things when they're not performing sympathy for you. There was no follow-up question, no attempt to talk me into feeling better about it faster than I was ready to. She just let the sentence sit there, and somehow that was more comforting than anything more elaborate would have been. Friday morning, I drove to the bank, not to do anything dramatic, just to look at the numbers. $45,312 paid out over 3 years for a trip that was now apparently a family trip that didn't include the man who'd funded it or the woman it was for. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time, longer than I usually let myself sit anywhere without a task attached to it. The lot was mostly empty, except for a delivery truck idling by the side entrance and a woman walking a dog in slow, patient loops near the curb. I watched them without really watching them, the way your eyes settle on something ordinary while your mind works through something that isn't. And somewhere in that hour, something in me didn't snap. It settled. It wasn't rage. It was more like watching a light finally turn on in a room I'd been sitting in the dark of for years and realizing I could see the furniture now, all of it, clearly, for the first time. I'd spent 30-some years arranging my life around the assumption that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the people I loved close. And sitting in that truck, I understood for the first time that those two things had actually never been the same thing at all. I just never had a reason clear enough to notice the difference until that morning. I called my attorney, a woman named Carol, who'd handled Beverly's estate paperwork 3 years back and had become, in the process, something close to a friend. I told her I wanted to change some things. Before I get to what I told Carol, there's a call I made half a day earlier that matters just as much. The afternoon of the text, I called the travel agent. It was almost 5, and she picked up on the second ring like she always did, cheerful in the way she always was, not yet knowing why I was calling. I need to cancel the remaining payments on the Bergen cruise, I said. The balance, the excursions, the dinner package I added in the spring, all of it. There was a pause on her end, the kind that told me she was recalculating something faster than she wanted to let on. Wesley, is everything all right? You've been so careful with this booking for 3 years. Everything's fine, I said, which wasn't true, but it also wasn't a lie I felt like unpacking with her at that moment. I just need it canceled, all of it. She went quiet for a second. You're inside the cancellation window already. You won't get the deposit back, and the last 2 installments are scheduled to draft automatically once the ship leaves port. I can stop that on my end, but I want you to understand, whoever's aboard on that reservation is going to find out the hard way if nobody pays it manually before then. I understood exactly what she was telling me, and I understood exactly what it would mean, and I said it anyway. Cancel it, I said. All of it. She did. I heard her keys clicking on the other end, methodical, the sound of 3 years of careful planning being unwound in under 2 minutes. I sat at my kitchen table afterward and felt something close to relief, which surprised me, because relief wasn't what I'd expected to feel that day. I'd expected grief, or anger, or some tangled combination of the two. What I actually felt was closer to the feeling you get when you finally set down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying with both arms for years. I didn't call my son to tell him. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't warn him. I let it sit exactly the way he'd let his mother's chapel sit. Beverly's house had been left to me outright, with the understanding, never written, just understood, that it would go to our son eventually. I told Carol I wanted to sell it, and I told her the proceeds, along with what remained of a small trust Beverly and I had built years back, weren't going where they'd been headed. Carol didn't ask me why, not directly, though I could tell she wanted to. She'd known Beverly a little, through the estate work, enough to have formed her own quiet opinion about the kind of woman she'd been. And I think some part of her understood that whatever had prompted this call, it wasn't something I'd arrived at lightly. She asked me a series of practical questions instead. Timelines, valuations, whether I wanted to list immediately or wait for a better season. And I answered all of them the way you answer questions when your mind is mostly somewhere else. Present enough to be accurate, not present enough to fully feel the weight of what I was agreeing to. Here's where I have to slow down because this part still surprises people when I tell it. I remembered something Beverly had said to me near the very end, half asleep on morphine, mumbling names, the kind of half-conscious talking that happens in those last weeks when the line between dreaming and speaking gets thin. She'd said the hospice nurse's name more than once, urgently, the way you say a name when you're trying to make sure someone remembers it after you're gone. She'd said, "Make sure she's taken care of, Wes." She never once took a dime she didn't earn. I hadn't thought much about that moment in the months since. Grief has a way of filing things away in places you don't revisit on purpose. But sitting there with Carol on the phone, it surfaced whole, unprompted, like it had been waiting for the right moment to matter again. The nurse had a daughter, 17 years old, wanting to go to nursing school the way her mother had, and no way to pay for it. I told Carol to draft a scholarship trust in Beverly's name through the hospital's hospice program, with the first recipient named outright. But there's one thing I want to say plainly, because it mattered more to me than anything else in that will. My son has 2 children, a boy who's 7 and a girl who's 5. I'd watched them grow up mostly from a comfortable distance. Birthday parties, holidays, the occasional Sunday dinner. Close enough to love them fiercely, not quite close enough to have any real say in how they were being raised. None of what was happening between me and their father was theirs to answer for. So I had Carol write a second trust, separate from anything my son or his wife could touch. A fixed sum for each of them, held and invested until the day each one gets married. Not 18, not 35, not when they need it for a house. Their wedding day, whenever that comes, however far off. And a clause underneath it in Carol's plainest legal language. If either parent ever attempted to access it, redirect it, or use it as leverage of any kind, the funds for that child would be forfeited entirely to the hospice program. No exceptions, no second chances. Carol read that clause back to me twice, slowly, to make sure I understood exactly how permanent it was before she filed it. I told her I understood completely. I didn't do that to be cruel to my son. I did it because I know him, and I wanted those 2 kids protected from him the way I never protected myself. The house sold in 11 days, cash offer. A young couple from a couple towns over, first-time buyers by the look of them. Nervous and excited in equal measure the one time I met them briefly to sign paperwork. No contingencies. I remember feeling, oddly, a flicker of something like happiness for them. Watching 2 people at the very start of a life I'd already lived most of mine, standing in a kitchen that had been the center of my entire adult existence and would soon become the center of theirs instead. I signed the papers on a Tuesday in the middle of summer, packed 2 suitcases, and flew to Bergen alone. On a smaller trip I booked myself, quietly, without telling anyone where I was going or why. No chapel tour group, no excursion package, none of the careful 3-year planning that had gone into the trip I'd originally built. Just a ferry schedule and a map, the kind of trip you take when you've stopped needing anyone else's permission to grieve the way you actually need to grieve. My son's family sailed 4 days after I landed. I know the exact day because the agent had mentioned it in passing before all this started, and some part of me had been counting down without meaning to, the number of days ticking backward in my head at odd moments. Standing in line at a small grocery, waiting for a ferry, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed, listening to a language I didn't understand drifting up from the street below. They had no idea the last 2 installments had ever been touched. Day 1 and 2, nothing. I pictured them at the buffet, at the pool, his wife's mother probably telling everyone how lovely it all was. The whole family moving through those first 2 days with the particular obliviousness of people who don't yet know the ground beneath them has already shifted. Day 3, guest services on that ship pulled my son's reservation and found a payment that had never gone through. A woman at the desk told him there was an outstanding balance of just under $9,000, the 2 installments, plus onboard charges already accrued, and that it needed to be settled in full by that evening, or the family would be put off at the next port, a small town on the Norwegian coast, and left to arrange their own way home. I wasn't there. I only know what came after because he told me himself, weeks later, in pieces, angrier each time he repeated it. I was standing outside that little white chapel with the black spire when my phone first buzzed in my coat pocket, a number I recognized, then another buzz, then another. I let it ring. I stood there and looked at the water, gray, green, unreal, and I said Beverly's name out loud because there was no one there to hear me and make it strange. 11 missed calls the first day, 29 by the third, texts stacked underneath each one getting shorter and more frantic. Dad, call me. Then, Dad, this isn't funny. Then, on the day they were put off the ship at that small coastal town, with his wife's mother in tears on the dock. Dad, where are you? He had no idea yet how much more there was to find out, but he would. My son got his family home 2 days later, on borrowed money from his wife's brother, is what I later learned. The very afternoon he landed back home, he drove straight to his mother's house. I know exactly what that looked like, because the young couple who bought the place called me themselves, confused, saying a man had pounded on their door, insisting it was his father's house. They said he stood on the porch for a long moment after they explained the sale, just staring past them into the the hallway like he was trying to see furniture that wasn't there anymore. He called 40 more times over the next 2 days. I still didn't answer. Not out of cruelty. That part matters to me. I answered when I was ready, not when he demanded it. There's a difference between the two that took me 61 years to learn. I finally picked up on a Sunday evening, sitting on a rented balcony with the sky still bright at 9. "Dad," his voice cracked on the one word. "What did you do?" I kept my voice level. "I canceled a cruise I was paying for that I wasn't welcome on. I sold a house that was never really going to be mine to keep once your mother was gone from it. And I changed my will. You left us stranded in Norway, Dad. Do you understand that? Her mother had to fly home separately. It was humiliating. I know what it feels like to be told on a family trip that you're not really family," I said. "You told me that at 6 in the morning over a text message. I found out what you told me meant a little more slowly, off a computer screen at a bank. Seemed fair you'd find out yours the same way. Slow and in public." He was quiet for a moment, then quieter. "The house, Mom's house, sold. The money went where your mother wanted it," I said. "Once I finally remembered where that was." "That's not fair," he said, "but there wasn't much fight left in it." "No," I said, "it's not about fair. It's about done. I'm done rescuing you from the consequences of who you've decided to be. That's different from punishing you. You'll understand that difference eventually. I hope you do." He didn't have an answer for that. My voice didn't rise the whole call. It didn't need to. "I'm not going to tell you he apologized in any way that meant something." He said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," which isn't an apology. It's a door closing softly. I let the call end there. I didn't chase it. That was, as far as I understood it that night, the end of the story. He knew what I'd done. I'd said my piece. I told myself that was enough, that I'd kept my promise, made my point, and could let the rest go quiet from here. I was wrong about that. Not about the promise, about the quiet. I flew home 3 days after that call. I want to tell you the story ended there, with him knowing what I'd done and me feeling like I'd finally stood up straight after years of bending. For about 2 weeks, that's exactly what it felt like. I settled back into a routine that was strange in its ordinariness, opening the store at 7, restocking shelves, having the same conversations with the same regular customers about weather and hardware and nothing important, all while carrying this enormous unspoken thing underneath it. A few people asked how the trip had gone, and I gave them some version of the truth that didn't require explaining the whole shape of it. Fine, I'd say. Beautiful, actually. I stood where I needed to stand. At night, in the new quiet of the house, smaller than the one I'd sold, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. I found myself replaying the confrontation call more than I expected to. Not with regret, exactly. More like the way you replay a hard conversation looking for the moment you could have said something differently, except I couldn't find one. I'd said what needed saying. He'd said what he had to say back. It felt complete, in the flat, unsatisfying way that completeness sometimes feels when there's no one left to celebrate it with. There was a particular evening, about 10 days after I got home, when I found myself standing in the kitchen of the smaller house doing something I hadn't planned on doing, going through an old box of photographs Beverly had kept. The kind of box every long marriage seems to accumulate without anyone deciding to start it. I found a picture of the three of us, Beverly and me and our son, taken when he couldn't have been more than 6, all three of us squinting into the sun at some lake I couldn't place anymore. I sat with that photograph longer than I meant to, turning over the uncomfortable arithmetic of how a person gets from that small boy in that photograph to a grown man sending a 6 a.m. text about a cruise his dying mother had asked for. I didn't know what to make of that arithmetic yet. I put the photograph back in the box and told myself the story was functionally over. I had done what needed doing. I had said what needed saying. Whatever came next between me and my son was going to be a slow, careful rebuilding, or it wasn't going to be anything at all, and either way I'd made my peace with not knowing which. Then the hospice nurse called again, not to check in this time. Her voice was different, careful in a way it hadn't been before, hesitant in a way I'd never heard from her, even in the hardest weeks of Beverly's illness. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I don't know if it's my place, but Beverly asked me to, if it ever came to this." I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat when Carol first told me about the trust, the same table where I'd sat after canceling the cruise. It had become, without my quite noticing, the place where the important calls landed. I didn't know what this meant yet. "About a month before she passed," she said, "your wife had me write something down. She made me promise I'd only give it to you if your son ever tried to take the cruise away from you." Her words, not if he changed his mind, not if things got complicated, if he tried to take it away. I felt something shift in my chest, a specific kind of dread that comes from realizing a story you thought you understood completely might have a second half you haven't been told yet. I asked her what it was. "A letter," she said. "She sealed it herself. I've had it in a drawer for 3 years. I didn't understand why she was so specific about the condition until your message a few weeks back. She mailed it to me that week. It arrived on a Thursday. Plain envelope. My name in Beverly's handwriting, a hand I hadn't seen new words in since before the hospital. I stood at my own mailbox for a long moment before I even brought it inside, turning it over once, twice, like I was checking whether it was actually as real as it looked. I sat with that envelope for 2 full days before I opened it. I want to be honest about that too. I was afraid of what was in it, the way you're afraid of anything that might mean someone knew you better than you knew yourself. I put it on the kitchen table where I could see it and left it there, unopened, walking past it a dozen times a day, making myself coffee and eating dinner alone with it sitting there like a held breath. On the second night, I finally sat down across from it, poured myself a drink I didn't usually allow myself on a weeknight, and opened it. When I finally opened it, it was 4 pages, front and back, in the handwriting I'd watched get shakier over 11 months but never stopped being hers. Even shaky, it was unmistakably her hand, the particular way she looped her lowercase g's, a habit from some penmanship class decades before I ever met her that she'd never quite shaken. She didn't start with love or with dying. She started with our son. She wrote that she'd known, longer than she ever told me, that he had a way of treating promises like they were weather, something that would pass, something you didn't need to plan around. She wrote about a conversation they'd had, just the two of them, near the end of her second month in treatment, when he'd asked her, almost offhand, whether the cruise money might be better spent on something more useful for his own family. Not cruel. Practical. The way people convince themselves practical isn't the same thing as cruel. I read that paragraph 3 times before I could make myself keep going. It wasn't that the content shocked me exactly. Some quiet part of me had suspected, without ever letting myself fully articulate it, that our son's priorities had drifted somewhere I didn't recognize. It was the specificity of it, the fact that she'd sat there, dying, and had this exact conversation, and had carried it alone for months rather than handing me one more thing to carry alongside everything else I was already carrying. She never told me about that conversation. Not once in the 9 months she had left. I sat there trying to understand why, and the answer was in the next paragraph before I'd even finished asking myself the question. She wrote, "I didn't tell you because I already knew what he'd try, and I needed you to find out for yourself, not from me warning you. If I warned you, you'd have found a way to forgive it in advance. You always do. I needed you to feel it the way I felt it when I realized my own son was already spending my trip before I was gone." That sentence took the air out of the room, not because it surprised me that he might have said something like that, because it meant she had known for the better part of a year and had chosen, deliberately, carefully, to let me walk into it blind, because she understood something about me that I hadn't fully understood about myself. I sat there with the letter in my lap and the drink going warm beside me, and I let myself feel, fully for the first time, the particular grief of realizing that the person who knew you best had also known exactly what your family would eventually do, and had loved you enough to let you learn it the hard way, instead of softening it in advance. I thought, sitting there, about all the years I'd spent believing that staying quiet was itself a form of love, that absorbing conflict without complaint, writing the checks without asking questions, letting things slide rather than making anyone uncomfortable, was simply what a good husband and a good father did. Beverly's letter was, in its own gentle way, telling me that this belief had cost me something I hadn't fully accounted for. Not my marriage. She'd loved me completely. That much was never in question, on every page of that letter. But something in how our son had been raised, some lesson about consequences he'd never quite learned because I'd always been there to soften them before they landed. I got up from the table at some point and walked out to the back porch of the smaller house, just to stand in the night air for a few minutes, letting the cold clear my head enough to keep reading. When I came back in, the letter was still there, 3 more pages waiting, and I made myself another drink before I picked it back up. The letter went on for 2 more pages, and most of it was ordinary in the way that dying people's letters are ordinary. Memories of our wedding, a joke about the year I forgot our anniversary and tried to fix it with a very bad poem, a line about how she hoped I'd let myself be happy again someday, whatever that looked like, with whoever that was. I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, at the anniversary joke, and then found myself crying almost immediately after, the 2 reactions arriving close enough together that I couldn't have told you where one ended and the other began. There was a paragraph, too, about the early years of our marriage before our son was born, when money was tighter than either of us liked to admit, and she used to make a game out of stretching a single grocery budget across 2 weeks, turning what could have been a source of tension into something we both, somehow, remembered fondly instead. But near the bottom of the 3rd page, she got specific in a way that stopped me cold. She wrote that she didn't want me to sell the house out of spite. She wanted me to understand that the house had never really been meant for our son at all. That was an assumption everyone had made, including me, because nobody had ever bothered to ask her directly what she wanted done with the one thing that had been entirely hers before we married. I read that line twice, because in 34 years of marriage, it had genuinely never once occurred to me that the house's future had been decided by default rather than by design. I'd simply absorbed the assumption the same way our son had, the same way everyone in the family had, without either of us ever actually confirming it with the one person whose house it originally was. She wrote, "The house was my mother's before it was mine. It was never really yours to promise away, and it was never really his to inherit. I let everyone believe otherwise for 30 years because it was easier than the conversation. I'm done being easier. Do with it what actually matters, not what was simply assumed." She named the nurse's daughter herself, in her own hand, before I'd ever thought to. She wrote the exact wording she wanted for the scholarship, wording almost identical to what I'd already told Carol, word for word in places, like she'd been carrying the shape of it in her head for months before she ever said a word to me. Reading her version next to the one I'd already dictated to Carol, seeing how closely the 2 matched without either of us having discussed it, was its own kind of vertigo, the sense that I'd been all along simply arriving at conclusions she'd already reached and quietly left waiting for me. And at the very end, she wrote something about our grandchildren that I hadn't told anyone, that I hadn't even fully articulated to myself until I read it back to her in her own handwriting. She wrote, "Protect them from him the way you never let anyone protect you from your own father. You'll know how. You always did. You just never used to believe you were allowed." I had to put the letter down after that line, not because I didn't understand it, because I understood it completely, immediately, in a way that made the whole of my own childhood rearrange itself slightly in my memory. My father, and the particular kind of quiet compliance he'd trained into me before Beverly ever came along to gently, patiently, spend 3 decades trying to undo it. I read that letter maybe a dozen times over the following week. Each time, the same paragraph landed differently. Here's what I understood finally. Sitting at that kitchen table with 4 pages of my dead wife's handwriting in front of me, I had spent weeks thinking I'd made a hard, lonely decision. Canceling the cruise, selling the house, rewriting the will to protect 2 children who hadn't asked for any of it. I thought I'd done all of that alone, in anger. In the 2 or 3 days after a 6 a.m. text broke something in me that had been holding for years. I hadn't done any of it alone. Beverly had already decided almost all of it, months before she died, and had simply been waiting, patiently, deliberately, for me to arrive at the same conclusions on my own, because she knew that if she'd handed me the plan directly, I'd have softened it before I ever carried it out. She knew me well enough to know that grief and love make me generous past the point of good sense, and she built a mechanism, a sealed letter with one very specific condition, to make sure that the version of me that finally acted was the version she'd trust to follow through completely. The reveal wasn't that I'd protected my grandchildren, or paid for a stranger's nursing degree, or stood alone in a chapel that meant everything to a woman who never got to see it. The reveal was that none of it had actually been my decision to make in the first place. It had been hers all along, and she had simply waited 34 years of marriage and 11 months of dying to finally trust me enough to let me think it was mine. I sat with that for a long time before I could stand back up from that table. The nurse's daughter started nursing school that fall, at a state school not far from here. She sent me a photograph of her first day, standing in front of the building in scrubs a size too big, grinning the way you grin when you don't yet know how hard the next 4 years are going to be. I keep that photograph in the same drawer as Beverly's letter now, which felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain to anyone who asked. I drove up to see her family once, that first semester, mostly because her mother asked if I would, and I sat in their small kitchen drinking coffee that was too strong, and listening to the daughter talk about anatomy lectures and clinical rotations with the kind of nervous excitement that reminded me, more than I expected it to, of Beverly talking about that chapel for 30 years before she ever got close to it. Hope sounds the same regardless of what it's attached to, and hearing it in that kitchen did something to settle a part of me that had been unsettled since the funeral. The church put a small plaque up in the fellowship hall with Beverly's name on it. Plain, unfussy, exactly the kind of thing she would have hated the attention of and loved anyway, in that particular way she had of pretending not to want the very things she'd quietly earned. I went to see it the week they installed it, standing there alone in the fellowship hall on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody else was around, and found myself talking to it for a few minutes the way you talk to a grave, except this felt more like talking to a version of her that was still, in some small way, doing exactly what she'd always done, quietly, without asking for credit. I bought a small place 2 streets from my store, 1 bedroom. More than enough for one person who stopped expecting company most nights. I furnished it slowly, over months, buying only what I actually needed rather than filling space out of habit the way you sometimes do in a bigger house. Downsizing deliberately turned out to carry its own kind of clarity, something I hadn't expected to find in it, but did, more than I thought I would. My son calls sometimes now, Sundays mostly. Careful conversations about nothing much. Weather, a leak in his gutter, whether I've been eating enough. I answer, I'm civil. There's an careful, deliberate distance to how we talk now that wasn't there before. Not hostile exactly. More like 2 people who used to know each other very well and are now relearning each other from a slight remove, testing which topics are safe and which aren't, without either of us saying so directly. His children don't know yet what's waiting for them, and they won't for a long time. That's the point of a thing like that. It isn't supposed to be known early. It's supposed to simply be there, waiting, whether anyone remembers to thank you for it or not. I see them a handful of times a year still, at the holidays mostly, and I watch them the way you watch something you've quietly decided to protect without ever telling them you're doing it. The boy is starting to ask harder questions about things than he used to. The girl still runs to hug me the exact same way she always has, unaware that anything between the adults in her life has shifted at all, and there's something almost unbearably tender about that particular kind of innocence. The fact that she still simply loves the people in front of her without any of the complicated accounting the adults have all quietly done in the background. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've made peace with my son the way people mean when they say that on television. I haven't. What I've made peace with is this. I kept my promise to Beverly, and I protected the 2 people in this whole mess who never had any say in what happened. That part I'm certain of. What I'm less certain of most nights is whether I ever really made a single choice in the entire thing, or whether I simply became, 3 years too late, exactly the man my wife had already decided I was capable of being, and had been quietly, patiently waiting for me to become, one sealed envelope at a time, long after she no longer had the breath left to tell me so herself. I still keep that letter in the drawer by my bed. I've read it more times than I can count, and every time I get to the last line and stop there the same way I stopped the first time. You always did. You just never used to believe you were allowed.